Good afternoon, everyone. So now this is quite a wild ride this afternoon, so now from the gore to cute animals, but that's how we roll. So this will be a bit longer session, and I also hope that you have questions that, at least I can, give my opinion or experience how we solved some of the challenges with different projects I've been working on. So maybe before getting into the topic, very briefly about me. So, well, as Oskar said, currently I'm working for Zynga as a lead of product and analytics. I've done games for about 20 years. I started with I started with SMS games and Java games back in the days. I've done some online multiplayer projects, and for the last 10 years, either working at Unity, providing tools for developers, or working for smaller or bigger studios. So before Zynga, I also worked as an advisor for Small Giant Games, which was a small startup back then. Now that's also part of Zynga, so that's again like how things go around, I guess. So I chose the topic as planning and risk management, as you can do soft launch in many ways or decide not to do it at all. But I wanted to start with a few quite obvious risks that if you do soft launch you most likely come across. Things like risks regarding the team and the sometimes lack of leadership. So leadership is super important when trying to get understanding of are you doing the right things or wrong things before publishing the game globally. The other typical problem that actually too many studios or teams face is lack of focus. When you start to get data, you start to get a bit confused, like what actually is wrong and what is right, and should we change or should we continue? So all of those are basically team-related problems. Then you have development-related problems, like you can't read the data, or you don't understand what should be the next steps. And then typically one of the player-related problem is that players run out of things to do in the game, so they basically run out of content. And then how can you try to understand if you are doing the right things or wrong things if players basically don't have enough things to do, so they just lapse or churn from the game. Those were the risks. Then we could talk about but why do we bother? Like, soft launching is expensive, more or less. You need to at least put your team into it. You might need to spend some money. I would say that the biggest value is actually related to the risks I just mentioned. Mobile games business is a global, as you know. The marketplace is global. When you launch a game, it will be on different or all around the world as you wish. That means that currently there are few key marketplaces if you really want to monetize the game that you need to succeed in, like North America, like US and Canada, like biggest European markets, like South Korea or Japan. And if you don't manage to, or if you decided to skip soft launch and go to your main market, for example USA, and then you realize that, we have technical problems, or players are running out of content, so they don't actually have anything to do, so of course they will leave the game. So what do? You have basically already lost that crowd. So soft launch is important both in understanding how to improve the game technically, as well as usability-wise and content-wise, so having enough depth in the game. Before moving to my 3 areas I want to cover, and this is very practical, focusing on examples, focusing on processes type of a talk. So I wanted to highlight on the key messages I want to deliver with this presentation. The one thing is that you need to be very smart on understanding what you need to have ready before starting soft launch. The other thing is that you need to understand that soft launch is not a separate phase of the game development. It's part of the continuum. And then you have to understand that you need to find ways to validate either technical or content or usability issues if you really want to leverage the risks or minimize the risks when you actually go to any market. Yep.
Sometimes the first one will be slow.
Okay, maybe I
did it. I could be your clicker.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So as I said, I will basically just focus on 3 areas, so I don't have tons of slides. I have few slides, but I want to go a bit more in depth on each of the topics. As mentioned as one of the key points, it is very important to understand that there is life and things to do before you actually go to soft launch. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to do certain activities before starting soft launch. So, okay. Now it works. Cool, thanks. Oops, sorry. Yeah, and then there are different set of things you actually have to do during soft launch, but that should be quite focused and relying on the things you actually do before going to that phase. And then you have the decision at your hand. You know, do you go big or do you decide to do something else? But let's start with the before soft launch. Why I think this is very important and why I think many developers do not emphasize it enough. There are a lot of things that if you don't validate core loop of the game or the key functionality or basic controls or user experience, you will lose basically a lot of money when you go to soft launch and realize those things not until then. So you need to be well prepared. And how to do that? Number of things. I will mention a couple of one and then give a few examples more in depth. But let's start with the team. So too often the development teams are too democratic in decision making, or they have a vision of creating something cool or something similar to another game, but they don't really have a clear common understanding of what actually is the vision that you are trying to achieve. All of this also ties into budget, so you need to be very clear about what do you actually have in terms of resources like people or in terms of resources as money. The second thing is, I'm jumping first to the X mark, so the second thing is about validation. You need to do both user testing, focusing on certain features, certain functionalities in the game, and you have to do longer term playtests in order for you to understand how the players progress in the game, how long does it take to level to certain level. Are there some issues later on which relates to, for example, balancing, or relates to the variety of different features that you are providing, but that players just for some reason do not get. So those are actually very, very useful and also cost-efficient ways to test and validate key things before even starting soft launch. My suggestion would be that focus on the core loop or core features. If you don't consider the loop to be relevant, every game has key features, the key things you expect the players to do. You should definitely validate those before going to the soft launch. The other thing is about basic gameplay controls, for example, how the player is able to interact with the game, or different features that you are providing. When you do the validation before soft launch, it means that you will do it before starting to scale the user base, which means that smaller number of people are more, basically more inexpensive. You don't have to spend that much money, but you actually can get very valuable feedback to qualitative testing. So focusing on smaller group of people, I typically do use user experience or playtests with 6 people, like group of 6. Sometimes with group of 15. That already gives you an understanding of these different issues players might have when playing the game. But with the small, for example, with 6 people playing the game for an hour, that doesn't really give an understanding what happens when they actually spend a bit longer in the game. So that's why I would suggest that do different, shorter and longer user testing before going to soft launch. How to do that? There are tools online. For example, Playtest Cloud is relatively affordable tool, but you can also do, if you really want to put down the costs, you can also collaborate with local university, for example, or just find random people that match to your target audience. Of course, the challenge there is that oftentimes the tester has an impact to the results if you actually are doing face-to-face. So that's why I would recommend to prefer online testing over face-to-face. But of course, those are basically the options. But with qualitative testing, you can validate the key things that work or don't work in your game. And you can improve that before starting to, one way or another, get more players in, which again means higher risks of losing that golden cohort or even the early players you might have, or then postponing the discovery of problems too late. The two other things marked with the green check mark. Content depth is something that, again, when thinking of managing risks, that is one of the key things. What I mean with content depth is that players have to have enough repeated gameplay in order to really stick around and start to explore other features that are available. So you need to have very deep core. In for example, racing game, it's slightly easier than for example in the builders, but there has to be something that's engaging enough for players to come back, to repeat again and again and again. And then there has to be supporting tasks, different features, different other things players can do in the game, which more just provide variety to the experience. If you are not repeating the core actions, there are other things you can do, for example, social features can be such. And then one thing you should have, at least on some level, before going to soft launch is some understanding of how do you measure, how do you define exit targets or targets for the validation. Few suggestions which I will actually get more in depth in a second, so I'll just briefly mention. So at least to get going, I would suggest you to think of the targets like, are you after revenue, or are you after reach or scale? So are you after eyeballs? Are you after players? There are different motivations to go one way or another. If you are starting, creating your first games, it might actually make more sense to focus on just getting visibility, getting players to play your game, instead of trying to make the multi-million hit game from the start. Then again, if you are trying to make business, of course, you should be focusing at least on some level on the monetary value or the monetization of the game. How to do that, I'll get into that in a bit. So when talking about data, usually, especially with smaller studios, the problem is that, if you are starting something new or you are starting your company, you don't have any data. So how can you know what are the targets or what you should be trying to achieve? My answer to that is that one way to start is to go with public data that's available online. This is just an example of some estimates on depending on what your game is about. But that's sort of a selection of different games, understanding of what would be if you consider for example creating certain gameplay or monetization, what actually are the potential there? How many players are you even potentially reaching, and what type of behavior those players have? How long time they are spending in the game? If you have some indications about how much money are they spending, that might also help you to understand is it even feasible for you to set certain targets, or should you more focus on that hyper casual games, certain things work differently than the number of sessions or the lifespan of a user is very different from, for example, games like Township, builder games. So the point is that you can use and should be using market data that you don't have to collect yourself. There are quite a bit of information available to even set sort of understanding of what is reachable, considering that you are doing a game similar to Coin Master, for example. Then when talking about metrics, my suggestion is that, well, of course, it's good to track different things in the game, but I would recommend you to try to keep it focused. So a suggestion is to the OMTM is one metric that matters, or some people call North Star metric as meaning the same thing. The point with the one metric that matters is that measuring gameplay or players' behavior has basically two things that you should keep in mind. One is communication with the team. Team should have a common understanding of, what are we actually, are we on the right track, or what actually is, what is the definition of good? And also when you try to measure too many things at the same time, oftentimes you don't know basically what's the sort of the hierarchy of details, what you actually should be considering more relevant than another. So the stuff I listed here are just an example. Typically, if the technical performance of the game is bad, it has an impact on basically all the other metrics. So it doesn't make sense to track retention when the crash rate is like too high. And yeah, even like less than 2% is actually quite high, so I wouldn't suggest that. I would actually suggest you to go a bit lower still. Another thing, if you want to focus on engagement, one option could be just to track the first session, like including like tutorial or whatever you have included for the new players. I think the first session being at least two times of an average session is a good way to understand, is there enough like engaging content in the game, and are our player understanding the general like value proposition of the game. But again, it's more about like decision making, like what do you think at certain phase of the development, what actually is the most important thing or metric to measure. And of course, like, yeah, then you can focus on retention metrics like ratios. When players spend longer time in the game, there are different install cohorts. How do they stick around or lapse or churn from the game? At some point, you might want to focus more on the payers, or then focusing on retention per install or such metrics. So it's more about decision making. So you can always track like tons of things, but in this case you need to have leadership, you need to have decision, what actually matters most at this phase of development. Time is running, so I'll hurry a bit to the soft launch. So as I said, like I think the before soft launch is very, very, very critical moment in time for your development. If you want to manage the costs, if you want to make sure that technically the game functions, so the technical problems do not ruin the other metrics. If you want to make sure that the core features are engaging to the players and interesting and captivating, so they actually keep playing on the game. Then if you have those boxes ticked, then you can start soft launch, deciding like whatever geos you want to go with. If you want to go with technical first, of course the decision is quite different than if you want to, for example, focus more on the gameplay validation. To me, soft launch is nothing more than hunting bottlenecks and opportunities. So you have the technical issues ticked, or the box ticked, you have core gameplay that's working, so you don't have to bother about those anymore. You should be more focusing on what actually is technically or like gameplay-wise not working, and or what are the growth opportunities, like what have you missed, what you are not providing to the players in order to make the game 2x or 10x. One tool for that is metrics pyramid. Again, many of the tools actually also are communication tools, because I'm coming back to the challenges with leadership, I guess, after like every other slide, but that's very, very important to make sure that the whole team has a common understanding of what are you measuring, like how good are we on the right track, should we be bothering with for example economy if we still struggle with the metrics or issues regarding like technical performance and early progression. And of course the answer is no, you shouldn't bother with economy before you have the like stable foundation. Then it's fine to start building the superstructure to the pyramid. And by the way, all these blocks are basically defined by the team, so this is just an example. But typically, as said, technical issues always have an impact on all the metrics, so then I wouldn't bother too much with spending a lot of time or money on validating engagement if the game is crashing. If the game is not crashing, and I feel I can see from the either like qualitative or quantitative user tests that players seem to be, getting the idea of the game. They seem to be excited about the core like value offer or the core features that we are offering. Then it's wise to focus on issues regarding, for example, engagement or gameplay of certain features, or economy, as you wish. So it's basically a decision that you have to make. But the nice thing about the pyramid is that this helps the communication within the team tremendously, because this is quite sort of easy to understand that you actually have to, when the foundation is like, again, like, we have the check mark, that's basically perfect, we can move on. We don't have to focus on everything at the same time. And we don't have to focus on things that we can't really have an impact on before certain other things are in order. This does not mean a lot of time spent or a lot of bureaucracy. This means more about keep the communication clear within the team, as well as have good understanding of the data. What actually is wrong when something is wrong? If you have too many open questions, it's very, very hard even from the basically any type of data to understand that is the problem actually here or is it there? As we really are not sure, as we haven't checked or validated things one by one. All of these have also helped you to figure out the budget and resources, like, what do you have? How many developers do you have? What's the team? Do you have money to put on the validation? If you go with like just very minimum amount or sum of money to do the testing, then of course you should consider like, how much do you focus on guessing, and how much do you actually, or which parts do you actually want to validate with players. So bottlenecks and opportunities, like what's holding you down or what's holding us down, and what are the new growth opportunities? Basically, two simple questions, but with when doing everything like basic validation before going to soft launch phase, and then when following the pyramid, this actually makes it rather, it's never easy, but it's easier to spot what actually are the issues that are not working in gameplay, technically. Maybe the player progression is too fast. Maybe they are just missing like half of the features during the reason of whatever it could be. Or maybe you realize that actually, because we are lacking like interaction between players, like social features, that has an impact on the player progression or the engagement of the player. If you don't have your own data, you can always have, if you don't have big data, you can always have small data. And you can always get market data. Even if, the averages, they're actually quite good averages. In the last section, I want to focus on a couple of challenges, because these are surprisingly often repeated in different game projects. So as a word of warning, when planning on validation, like the before soft launch and during soft launch phases, so any point before actually launching the game globally, make sure that the end goal is not moving, or you actually have clear understanding of how do you validate. So use the pyramid or use other way to clearly communicate with the team and understand what actually, what's right and what's not working. One of the challenges is that when there are problems. There's no one making the hard decisions, or there are a lot of ifs and buts. Like it could be this or it could be that, but maybe if we do 2 more features, everything will be perfect. Maybe that's the case, but someone has to make the decision, even if it turns to be a wrong one. Update plan in a flux also means that, again, basically bad planning. You need to have an understanding of how often are you able to update the game. So depending on how do you validate between the updates, how do you learn what actually is right and what's wrong, or what should be improved? Do you need more time to fix bigger issues in the game, or is it more about like tweaking features or adjusting, balancing, or the speed of progression? Fixing problems with new features is basically, again, like happening too often. If you see a problem, you think that it's problem because you are just lacking something, whereas you might, or maybe you should focus more on what actually is wrong in the current set of features. And lastly, rushing conclusions with data. So if you don't have a lot of data, focus only on qualitative testing. So doing playtests, recorded playtests, going through the videos, going through the player feedback, trying to understand from there. If you have a bit more data, then be very critical about the reading of the data. My suggestion with this one is that one thing that actually helps to understand what works and what doesn't is to do parallel analysis utilizing different methods of validation. Like for example, first doing a quick UX test with 6 people, getting the recordings, and then doing potential fixes if there are any fixes, and maybe repeat the same method or utilize another method to validate the learnings. So this was basically, I think I already spent, yeah, I know, I wanted to leave time for like sort of chatting, but I've already spent a bit too much time, but let's do so that I'll stop here and open the floor for questions if you have any. If you don't, I have my own set of questions to talk with you.
Hi, I've got 3 questions.
Yeah.
You say when you...
Oh wait, there's...
Yeah, very useful presentation, thank you. First question is, you mentioned you can launch globally as a soft launch. Would you recommend picking 1 or 2 countries first, and if so, which ones?
Yeah, so it depends on the goal. Like, what do you actually try to achieve? If you just want to make sure that you are able to scale so that the game doesn't break when you have more players in, so basically the servers are fine and all that, of course you should just go to the lower CPI countries like Thailand, Philippines, the usual suspects. So that would be the good way. If you're a small studio, I wouldn't recommend that, because I think you should just jump to a lookalike market, and that's a bit more challenging. What actually is a lookalike market for your game? Usually one way to do it is just to go to Sensor Tower or App Annie if you don't have access to any more in-depth data, just to check out the grossing lists to see what type of titles are there, that are your key reference titles, and see what type of maybe lifespan the games have had there.
Just to jump in quickly, because obviously I know a little bit about your situation, Tony. I think the advice has specifically changed over the last year or two.
Yeah.
I think a year or two ago, I think we were looking more at doing soft launches in specific territories, but I think we've moved away from that generally. Is that fair?
Well, yeah. So it's a bit sort of case by case. If you want to play it safe, you basically scale, not one market at a time, but basically one sort of validation focus at a time. But yeah, I think the biggest change that has happened is like moving more quickly to more, as US and Canada are for most of the developers, that's one of the it's the number one market. So for that, the easy lookalike markets are, for example, like Australia in terms of like monetization and retention. For example, in builder games, which we are all farming builders that we are building.
Thanks. Do you tell people in the description that it's a soft launch?
No.
Why not?
I don't see we are not taking the game out of the store. So it's more about and we don't ruin their experience. We don't if they spend some money, we don't trash their experience. So it's just sort of an evolution of the game from that point onwards.
I've actually done with PlayStation Home, we actually were launched as a beta. We were publicly telling people it was a beta. In fact, the game never came out of beta in the sort of...
Well, that was my next question. How long is a soft launch?
Well, that's a good question.
Depends on... I think the whole decision of do or don't soft launch is depending on your budget. But I'm more like data driven, so if following steps and making sure that you have the basic stuff actually validated, the gameplay related things validated before you can go, before going to soft launch, and you don't have any major, for example, technical issues, you can basically go well with 4 months. Then you have a good cohorted retention data from.
So on the retention and engagement.
Actually, Tony, because I've got only a minute left.
Okay, yeah, I'll pass it on. I'll talk to you after. It's very good.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thanks.
definitely. Please talk to Sonja. She's fantastic at this stuff. I want to just give someone else a chance to ask one quick question, just a very quick one if anyone wants to. I don't have a lot of time, so in that case, I will say thank you very much, Sonja.
Thanks.
Please go talk to Tony. Tony's got a really great game. I know that because I like working on it.